Welcome to my first quilt. I'm Sarah, and in this episode, I would like to share some tips with you about how to wrangle a big quilt under your sewing machine for quilting. So I've got a big quilt top here, and what I've done is I've laid out my backing, my batting, and then placed the quilt top on top of that. It's good to do this on a nice big flat surface so that you can make sure you've smoothed any little wrinkles out, especially out of the backing fabric, because if there's a wrinkle in it when you start to quilt, it's going to live there. You won't be able to get rid of it. So having a nice big table to do this on is really handy. I prefer a big table like this. Maybe it's your kitchen table you take over every once in a while, instead of the carpeting on the floor, because your backing fabric will kind of stick to the carpeting and it's hard to keep that all nice and straight. You could use some painter's tape and just tape it down literally to the carpet to keep it still. But the other thing that happens is when you baste, sometimes you'll catch some of those carpet fibers. So if you've got a nice big table like this that you can lay out, it's a good idea to do that just for laying out those 3 layers of your quilt sandwich and for basting it. And if you don't have access to a big table, just ask at your local quilt shop. Maybe in their classroom they'll allow you to use the table every once in a while just to pin a quilt. We do that at our shop, and it's not a problem at all. So once you have laid everything out and you're ready to quilt, you need to make sure you do something to adhere those 3 layers together so they don't shift during the quilting process. You can baste it by hand, just with a long hand basting stitch. My favorite method is to use safety pins. Safety pins come in a couple different types. There's, of course, a small safety pin and a long one. And I think that when you're going through those 3 layers of thickness, it's a lot easier if you use a long safety pin. Now, my very favorite style of safety pin is one that's curved. These also come in a small and large size, and they're much easier on your hands for pinning your quilt. So when you're working with these curved safety pins, you can literally just poke it through your 3 layers, pop it back up, the end of it curves up for you, and you can clasp that safety pin. Not a bad idea to use a thimble as if you were hand sewing, so that as you're poking those together, you don't damage the tips of your fingers. I know I've had raw fingers from pinning quilts in the past. Now, when you pin baste your quilt, it's a good idea to make sure that you pin at least every 4 to 6 inches. And I tend to kind of stagger my pinning. So I might put pins here, and here, and here, and I just kind of stagger them as I go. So like that, and then maybe toward the sides here, just to keep everything together. I always make sure that when I'm pinning my quilt that I start from the center and then work my way out, and that way I can kind of smooth any little ripples. If you start from the outside and work your way in, you may find that you kind of gather in your quilt, and that can cause a little ripple or a little wrinkle in your quilt. So you, again, want to work from the center out in both directions. Now, if you are free motion quilting your quilt, it's also a good idea to work from the center out, even as you're quilting after you've basted. Now, of course, before those pins get to your needle, you want to make sure you remove them so you don't stitch them in. Now, a couple of little tips for designing how you're going to quilt your quilt once it's pin basted. Maybe you're just stitching in the ditch and following along the lines. That's a really great place for a beginner to start. You can very carefully stitch right in the ditch of your seams. Or another great way for a beginner to start is just straight line quilting. You could run the edge of your 1/4 inch foot along your seam, and then you would have some pretty straight line quilting 1/4 inch off of the side of your seam. A favorite technique of mine. You can also use a quilting guide. Those attach to the side of the machine, and you can have spacing even. It's kind of like using a foot with a guide on it, except that it gives you bigger spaces, and you run the edge of the guide along your previous row of stitching and just keep moving away from center, and you can have really cool looking evenly spaced stitching farther apart than just the sewing machine foot. Now, if you're wanting to get creative with drawing on a motif, you can use a little pencil like these. They come in a couple different colors, and it's nice to have different colors based on different colors of fabric that you may be working with. And you can literally draw your quilting motif right onto your fabric. So see, I can see the gray really well on the orange fabric, but on the blue, the white shows up a little bit better for me. So you can literally just draw on any motif that you might like to follow as you free motion sew. Now, if that's not exactly your comfort zone, you can use stencils. There are templates, lots of different ways that you can mark a motif onto your quilt, or you can just go at it free motion style. It's kind of fun to play with that. Now, another handy tool if you're free motion quilting is a pair of quilting gloves. What's special about these gloves, they're very, very thin, so they don't make your hands too hot, but they've got little grippies on the bottom of them, and they do come in a couple different sizes. And what is so fantastic about these is when you're wrangling that quilt around, trying to move it under the machine, you can tend to really be squeezing hard, and you might find that you have sore hands after a long day of quilting. But these gloves grip to the fabric, so all you have to do is hold on to the fabric and move it around, and that quilt will move for you. They actually kind of stick to the fabric. So instead of trying to grab the fabric to maneuver it underneath of the needle, I can just hold on to it with my gloves and it will move really freely. So when we start to quilt, again, we want to start from the center, but we've got all this extra fabric that we need to get inside of the throat of the machine. So the best way to handle that, if I just scoot this over a little bit, is simply to roll your quilt. So if you just kind of fold it over on itself, just like this, and then just keep folding. I've got the same stripes on the front as I have on the back of this. And you can just kind of roll and roll until you get to the center portion. Maybe that's one too far. And then you can slide that entire amount underneath of your machine and you would be ready to sew. So you can sit down at your machine, and when you get positioned at your machine for free motion quilting like this, there are a couple of things that you want to consider. You want to make sure that you're in a chair that's going to give you good support that you can sit really comfortably in. It's a lot of work to do this free motion sewing, especially with a big heavy quilt. And you also want to make sure that you've got your arms at a good angle to your project. You may need to lift or lower your chair so that you aren't quilting up here or quilting way down where you have to lean over. So it's important to make sure that you've got your body positioned in front of the machine so that you can easily move your fabric, easily see the needle, and you're not having to slouch or, like I said, quilt way up here. As you're quilting, keep in mind your posture. I know that everybody's grandma says stand up straight, right? And my grandma's one of them. I have a tendency to hunch over. So just try to, as you're quilting, be conscious of sitting up straight so that you're not hurting your shoulders and your back. And once you've got yourself positioned, you're ready to attach your open toe foot, select a free motion stitch, or maybe you're not free motion stitching, maybe you're just stitching in the ditch or doing straight lines. Whatever quilting motif is your preferred type. And then if you do want to move your fabric around, say you've finished, you can just unroll. You can unroll as you go and move around. You can always drop the needle in the machine and just pivot the fabric around and then roll in a different direction. So you've always got the ability to reposition the fabric, roll it in a different way to access a different part, and that's going to really help you to keep your fabric under control as you are quilting. One last tip when you're working with quilting big fabrics like this, if your machine sits above your quilting table, you may find that the weight of the quilt pulls against the quilt and pulls it away from the needle. So I happen to have my machine in a koala cabinet, and what's nice about this is that my machine sits right down into the cabinet, and then I can easily have a large quilting space. But if you don't happen to have a piece of sewing furniture like this, maybe you don't have space for it or it's on your wish list and you haven't gotten it yet, you can also purchase an extension table for almost any sewing machine out there. You can get one that's plastic or one that is a clear plexiglass and it's got legs and it will sit up above the table and it literally sits right onto the free arm of your machine. It extends your work surface out and back and front, and that will also help with some of that pulling of the quilt, because when it's pulling off the side of the machine, you find that you're trying to lift it up with one of your arms, which again tends to create some strain in your neck and shoulders as you quilt. So when you're ready to begin quilting your quilt, just take a little bit of time to think about what's going to be the best method for you. How are you going to quilt your quilt? Lay it out nice and straight. Make sure you've got a nice quilting space for yourself that's going to be easy on your mind and on your body, and then just have fun and experiment with your quilting. Thanks so much for watching today. I hope to see you again soon. This episode of My First Quilt has been brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing, OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Furniture provided by Koala, fine sewing furniture custom built for you.